Hi, welcome back. I'm Carrie Burns, and this is a continuation of my course in the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of John Dee. We're up to the second installment of class 22, where we're talking about the 22nd theorem, but this part of the class, anyone can understand. So I know I usually give this long spiel where I say that I am assuming you've read and understood the hieroglyphic monad up to a particular point. Not necessary this time. Also, though, for those of you who have been following along, you remember back in Theorem 21, there was a whole section on the forming of the letters that I said I would roll into my discussion of Theorem 22, and that's what I want to do now. At the end of Theorem 21, Dee directs you to go back through the whole monad with wiser meditations, and one of the things that you might be meditating upon is the forming of the letters. In fact, it's a common practice in Hermetic Kabbalah, just as in Rabbinic Kabbalah, to meditate upon a letter in the Hebrew alphabet every day. You could do a similar type of thing with the Greek alphabet if you wanted to, but I've never heard of anyone doing that with, say, the English alphabet. So it's a practice that seems somewhat unusual to us in the modern world, probably unless we're Hermetic Kabbalists. So let's jump in here. By the end of this video, I'm going to go through that graphic filled with letters in Theorem 22, but I want to set up quite a few things before then. So you know the graphics that you had in 21. The monad is flipped. If you've been following along, you know why it's flipped. If not, don't worry about it. And then you see in his three little squiggly lines there, you have learned all of the things that Dee is doing with that little letter. First of all, it's his Aries glyph, right? That's one thing. But if you do Greek geometry the ancient Greek way, you should be able to draw everything with compass and straight edge. So those are two semicircles. You put them together and you get a circle like the one down in E. But beyond that, it is the lowercase Greek omega. You stand it up, here it becomes a lowercase epsilon. You transpose it and you've just got a flipped epsilon. But what if you push those together? Well, then you get two circles touching at one point, like his double grades of the moon. You also could have the Arabic letter, number 8. Now, in the Renaissance, they don't use Arabic numerals the way we do. Okay, but of course Dee knows what Arabic numerals are. He knows that's an 8, and also that's an infinity sign. So that's pretty cool. We also noticed down here that this diagram was a little odd. It seems to be missing an A. That is, we don't equate letters and numbers the way they do in Greek and Hebrew, where alpha literally means 1, aleph literally means 1. But usually we put A first, and there is no A here. And then they're out of order. Why is this B, D, C, E, for example? Then we go on to 22, and we get this graphic. All right, now we have Roman letters, Latin letters, we have Greek letters, and understanding the letters and the connotations of the letters becomes quite important, especially since we might wonder, why do we have a V and an X in there? Why do we have M's? I mean, we haven't gone through the whole alphabet, so what gives? Also in 22, there is this wild sequence of letters. What I've clipped there is actually from the original Latin. So you, instead of seeing this as something that looks, it's a false cognate artificial spiral, it's really an artificial vent in Latin. And then, about the spiral, when we get back to these words, we're going to still treat this false cognate like a spiral, but more on that later. An and then you get all of these letters. Now down here, litrovinium, if you don't read Latin, that looks like Latin. It's not, trust me. And if you try to read this Hebrew, you'd start here with the aleph and read this way. But if you are watching this and you do read Hebrew, you know that those are not words. They are just a sequence of letters with seemingly random spaces between them. Why is that? And then it ends with Pteronibus Operis, the Tyrian work, the great work, the quest for the philosopher's stone and achieving it. But What are we to make of these letters? If you are going back through the whole hieroglyphic monad, one of the places you first become conscious of the shape of the letters themselves is in Theorem 8. That's where D is getting excited about the letter X, which is the 21st letter of the Latin alphabet of his time, 3 times 7 and so on. And it's also the Greek chi. From that we get chi rho as a symbol for Jesus. Maybe that's why he is interested in it. Hold the thought about how you can flip it into a shape, but I want to first point out that among the great artistic lights of the Renaissance, the famous painter Albrecht Dürer also writes a book of geometry, and one of the things Dürer talks about, as we discussed back in 8, is the just shaping of letters, how to make them with a compass and straight edge. And I also mentioned a modern person who has done work on that, David Goines. That is, he went through and figured out with Roman block letters, the kind that the Romans chiseled into monuments, block letters, how to make each of those with compass and straight edge, because someone doing inscriptions would have to do that, right? Someone gets up and draws the letter on there. And I'll drop in again the link to his poster session because it's a fascinating study. But D at that time is also flipping letters into shapes. I know we just went ahead to Theorem 16. I'll get back to that in a minute. But the X can be flipped into this shape, two cones that share one point and are perpendicular to a Euclidean frame of reference. This is in his famous LVX theorem, which is the origin, or the only known origin, of the signs of the adept used in modern esoterica. It also means light in Latin. But D doesn't just say that, and he doesn't just say it's the crux of the matter, what crux means cross in Latin, and his central symbol, the light of the cross. He's also signing it all through the theorem. He writes it the way that you'd write it in Latin a couple of times. He does LVX backwards to us, the way you'd write it in Hebrew a couple of times. Now, this allows, among other things, a whole hidden level of the text we've talked about, which basically came to an ending in Theorem 20, where he is using that plane of reference to slice these two cones in a couple of ways and come up with different things that, like ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas, and so on. But he also likes the L because it reminds him of what? El, Aleph Lamed in Hebrew, God Most High. And probably of less, but only slightly less important, the L of a lineus rectum, which is part of a particularly fascinating mathematical transformation. Okay, so that brings us to Theorem 20. Oops, hold on here. Let me go back for a moment. All right, we'll try this one more time. Okay, in Theorem 22, he's asking you to basically metathesize some letters, or maybe I made that word up. He says to pay attention to the metathesis of letters. And where has he gotten that from? He's Latinized a Greek word, something he does a lot of, and it's from a Greek word that means I put things in different orders. Usually in Latin, you'd use transpositio, like transposition of letters, something that I just talked about with that omega. Just as a side note, for those of you who are interested in Dean Kelly's later Enochian work, there's a whole bit about the transposition of letters that the angels are talking to Dee about in the lettering of the perimeter of the Holy Table. So this kind of thing is a lifelong interest of his. But local metathesis of parts simply means you interchange two or more contiguous segments or syllables or parts. In etymology, you get metathesis a lot. Take a word we've used a lot in Latin, parabola, which in Dee's time usually means parable, although that mathematical meaning is starting to come in, so that's how he sneaks in his stuff about conic sections. But as Spanish grows out of Latin, the Spanish word for word, palabra, comes from the Latin word for story, parabola, which is kind of cool. In local dialects, you can have a metathesis of sounds. So a letter or a sound might shift. If we write out pretty, for example, but the way we say it is purty, well, that's a metathesis of sounds. Sometimes people do this with seemingly unrelated words. I am no great light of public speaking. I mainly read words. So two words I have trouble with are cavalry and Calvary. Sometimes it seems like I am talking about sending a bunch of horses in when I am talking about a cross, for example. But that's metathesis of sounds. Stem changing verbs always have a metathesis, and there are rules that explain that, though we don't usually learn those rules. But say in English, sing, sang, sung, that's a metathesis. You also, if you have a language without vowels, knowing the sounds to put in, then the rule is the meaning. So you have that in something like the Sefer Yetzirah. And let me show you here, since you have presumably read the Sefer Yetzirah for my class, right? So the opening of the Sefer Yetzirah, as you know, is where it says, by 32 mysterious paths of wisdom, Yah has engraved all things. Yah, who is the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, the living God, the Almighty God, he that is uplifted and exalted, he that dwells forever, and whose name is holy. Having created his world by three derivatives of what is a Hebrew root word, Semic, Pei, Resh, namely Sefer, Sephor, and Sippur. So depending on the metathesis of sounds you put in, this can mean a book, account, or a story. And in fact, the book is a story and account. You also may think of fortuitous parallel in the Timaeus of Plato, where Timaeus is saying that his Pythagorean cosmogenesis there is a story, and he tells you that story. I'm going to tell you some stories here about the letter Aleph, and then we're going to get back to those graphics, particularly the one in 22. But before I tell you some stories, let's look at the first letter of D's sacred alphabets, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. We use the same alphabet as they do in Latin. So you see capital A's, they're the same ones we use in English, and two small A's. This is the Greek alpha, the capital alpha. It looks just like our A. The small one is like this, and you have seen that in the hieroglyphic monad. There's the Hebrew Aleph. Hebrew doesn't have small letters, but both alpha and Aleph come from the same Phoenician Aleph, which you see pictured here, which is a West Semitic word for ox. Now, I know I've talked about how D and people in the Renaissance would not know hieroglyphics. So I'm just throwing in this picture of an ox head to compare to the Phoenician word. But it happens that that is also the hieroglyph for ox, which is sort of cool. We know that Latin is an Indo-European language. Greek is an Indo-European language, whereas Hebrew is a Semitic language. Within Indo-European languages, you can break them up even more. So say English is West Germanic. Latin is a Romance language like Spanish, French, Romanian, Italian, some other Portuguese. But the alphabet used comes in a large part from Semitic languages. Languages like Hebrew. So Aleph is the first letter of, I think, all, but at least many of the Semitic abjads. That is a ancient, usually liturgical alphabet that doesn't have vowels, like Classical Arabic, Syriac, Aramaic, Ge'ez, the complete Book of Enoch, when it was discovered in Ethiopian, was written in Ge'ez. For some reason, this is common of Semitic liturgical languages. Liturgical language is a language used in some kind of ritual by people who don't speak that as a first language, even if they speak some dialect of it as a first language. So there are many people who are Jewish who go to the synagogue and hear Hebrew who have a different first language other than Hebrew. And if there is Israeli and it is their first language, the text, the intonations used by the cantor and the way the Torah is read is very likely not going to sound like spoken Hebrew. The same thing if your first language is Moroccan Arabic. You will still, in school, if you're Muslim, study classical Arabic. Why? Because it's the language of the Quran. It's the language that you're going to hear at the mosque. In Dee's time, this is also true of Latin and Christianity. People read the Bible in the Latin Vulgate. Now, D doesn't, but D is kind of the exception that reads the rule, that proves the rule. He reads the New Testament in Greek, but he's his own special case, right? So the Christians in Europe at that time don't speak in Latin to each other unless they are educated humanists using it as the lingua franca, so to speak, of communication. But their first language is going to be a vernacular language like English, French, German, etc. All right. So what I want to do is tell you some stories here about the letter alpha or aleph to show you a different way of thinking about this type of thing that went on for probably millennia, but certainly centuries. Okay, our alphabet, as you know, the English alphabet, which is the Latin alphabet, doesn't have built-in numerical correspondences, whereas alpha means one, aleph means one. But there are other correspondences that are built into Hebrew and Greek. For example, in Greek, the 7 vowels correspond to the 7 planets. They correspond to 7 musical notes. I mean, there's a beautiful system of correspondences, and it changes over time, something I'll talk a bit more about if it seems relevant in our next video. But they also have stories attached to them, and these are really delightful stories. So since we're likely to know more stories about Hebrew if we know any at all, or we're likely, if we heard any stories about English, we might have heard it, I don't know. In my generation, we heard it on Sesame Street, and then that was kind of the end of stories about letters of the alphabet. But let me tell you a story about the Greek alpha just for kicks. Okay, you've probably heard of Plutarch. Plutarch is a great writer of the classical era. In one of his works, he's talking to a character called Ammonius. Ammonius asks Plutarch what Plutarch thinks about Cadmus. Cadmus is the person who brought the Greek alphabet, according to legend, from Phoenicia to Thebes, modern day Luxor in Egypt. And he settles there, and the story is that Cadmus put alpha first because it's the Phoenician name for ox. So they discuss this. Plutarch is not really thrilled by this story. After they talk about Hesiod and a bunch of other things, they get back to this, and Plutarch says, in effect, he sees no reason why that's a reason to put alpha at the beginning of the alphabet, and he gives you a story from his grandpa Lamprias. Lamprias told him that alpha is first because it's the first sound that kids make. They say, ah. It doesn't take anything special with your tongue or your lips. You can just say, ah. And that, according to the grandpa of Plutarch, is why alpha is first. Of course, the first story is the one that's probably correct. But there are stories like that about all of the letters. Let's take a common story about the letter aleph, which will actually be important in understanding these diagrams. So there is a whole midrash, actually, that is praising the humility of the letter aleph. Why? Because it doesn't insist on being the first letter of the Torah. Now, that implies that Aleph has already been created by God, and we actually just heard about that in the Sefer Yetzirah, right? But the reward for Aleph being that humble and not insisting to start the Bible is that Aleph gets to start the 10 Commandments. And you might think, well, how does Aleph start the 10 Commandments? Well, because the first commandment is one, which is Aleph, among other things. And there are all kinds of other things that you can study about Aleph. It doesn't matter if you're doing it playfully or as a serious scholar. Sometimes we do our best studying when we're doing it with kind of beginner's mind, doing it playfully. In the Sefer Yetzirah, you get Aleph, for example, as the king over breath, which becomes the element, or is the element air, formed air in the universe. Aleph rules the chest in the body of the soul. It's also the first letter of the Hebrew word Amet. Think of D's later, Sigelim D, Amet. And that word means truth. There are wonderful stories about artificial humans, golems, created by people like, say, Rabbi Lowe in Prague, same era as when Dee and Kelly are later there. And when they create this out of the red earth atom, out of clay, they create this artificial human. On the forehead of this artificial human, it says Amet. But if it's time to put the golem to sleep, you just, well, that would be, by the way, Aleph Mem Tav. If you take the Aleph off of there, it puts the golem to sleep. Why? Because Mem Tav is how you would write death. Another fun story involving the letter Aleph. And there are many. It begins God's name in Exodus, that is usually translated as I am who I am. It's part of mystical amulets and all kinds of other things that we could talk about. But this way of thinking and meditating about alphabets may, like I said, be unusual to people in our time. It's not that unusual to an educated humanist in Dee's time. I'm going to share my screen here. And something else that we might think about then is where alphabets come from. We at least might think about that in studying the hieroglyphic monad, because it is, if nothing else, an inquiry into origins, the symbolic creation, ending, and rebirth of the world. So we know that in the Sefer Yetzirah, Hebrew comes from God. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you don't even write out God. Although, to be fair, since I'm not an Orthodox Jew, you have noticed this is the first time I've written God like that. Usually I write it out, or sometimes I even put a small g. But you shouldn't even write the name, is the idea for writing God that way. For the Greeks, the alphabet, like I said, was brought from Phoenicia by Cadmus. Writing itself, though, in stories about the Greek alphabet, writing itself is the creation of Thoth, who by the end of the classical period and continuing through to the beginning of the Common Era is sort of rolled in with Hermes, and who also, according to some stories, created writing. And sometimes it is Thoth with his wife, Seshat. There are some people who thought a pre-Hebrew Adamic language was known by the prophet Enoch. Yes, John Dee would be one of those. So would Edward Kelly, hence their later Enochian work, where they're trying to find the language of angels. And they even call the language not Enochian, but angelic. Enoch is the grandfather of Noah, and Enoch can talk to the angels. That leads to another kind of, to me, funny story about alphabets. So some early Nestorian Christian evangelists go to China and they encounter the legends of Fuji. That's who you see in the picture there. I used that picture in an earlier class to note that compass and straight edge, which is what they're holding above their heads there, Fuji and his sister Nuwa, who together create humanity in some legends in China. But one of the things that Fuji did when he and his sister, after they've created humanity, is they each start creating things, and Fuji, according to some stories, creates the trigrams of the I Ching. So the Nestorian Christians learn that, and they think, oh, that must be the Chinese name for Enoch. Okay, now actually creating an alphabet by oneself isn't something that we know of as being hardly ever done. In fact, the only story about this I know is one that ends very sadly, and it's the story of the great Sequoia. The only human I know who actually created a written language. Sequoia created the Cherokee syllabary, and the thanks he got for that was being marched west with the rest of the Cherokee Nation as part of the Trail of Tears. So there is that very sad story. I'm going to take a breath now and continue on with the graphics in Theorem 21. So we've noticed in this graphic that we don't have an A or an Aleph. Maybe that's why E is artificial, but there is definitely not an A or an Aleph. And that's interesting. But I mentioned how there is this midrash praising Aleph for its humility because it doesn't start the Torah. Well, what does start the Torah? B or Bet or Beth in the beginning. And the way that would be spelled out in Hebrew would start with the Beit Bereshit. So maybe this B is here because it's Bereshit. And then that makes sense, doesn't it? Because the world has not started up here in the Ein and Ein Sof Ahur. It has started when there is this flash of light from Bina through Dot, creating the middle pillar of the tree. And then the tree forms. And by the time that Edenic era ends, time begins. That's the end, in effect, of the 7 days. So now this starting with a B makes sense when we realize that this flipped monad is, in effect, describing creation in the first 10 theorems. We've also done a lot of things with geometry. So just as a side note, in Euclid, he doesn't number things. Oh, wait, he does, because he letters things and he's writing in Greek. So implicitly, when you get Greek letters on diagrams, they're being numbered. So this one was missing a 1, starts with a 2, then it goes to a 4, and then back to a 3 and to a 5. Okay, why that is? Next discussion. All right, we know that this D in Greek would be a delta, a fire triangle. That's sometimes how D wrote his name. This C is also the source of the letter G, by the way. So we've talked about E as being the path of the initiate, a kind of, in a sense, an artificial atom or a homunculus, because there's no dot there, no piercing flash of light down the tree in one ray, no stillbone, none of those type of things. But one thing we do know, since this is 5, that this whole circle doesn't correspond to Tiferet because 6 would correspond to Tiferet. All right, we've discussed all that before. And the B graphic Aries, we've talked about how it can be an epsilon. It also is a rudely drawn symbol for lowercase omega. It's flipped, rotated, and there is a whole series of associations that goes on at the end of Theorem 21. That is, that top of the B, without the cross of the elements that's attached below, before you make them into Saturn and Jupiter. If you are in my class, you know what I'm talking about. And if you've just joined in for this one, ignore what I just said because it will make no sense. But B gets equated with Aries. Aries is the first of the fire triplicity. Then the exaltation of the sun is in Aries. And then he goes into, oh, Aries of Aries, that's the equinox. 12 and 12 are equal if it's Aries of Aries. He's also, I should have put those up there first, but you flip it and you get an epsilon. Some other things that you have at the end of 21 that I didn't get to was the whole bit about the inverted Aries and it corresponding to as many rustic letters as it bears conspicuous points on its head, so to speak, namely these 3 and another 6. Well, what are those? Well, first, we need to look at omega and understand what omega is. We can flip it around a bunch, and we've done that, but it is the 24th, 12 and 12, 24, 24 theorems, 24 hours in a day, 12 gates in the underworld, all things we've talked about here. It's the 24th and final letter in the Greek alphabet. It's a Greek way of writing 8. There is a thing also that goes on often about 7 implying an 8 in Greek gematria, because think of the scales and the 7 vowels correspond to 7 notes, and then they repeat with the 8th note. If you're playing piano or organ, you know that, right? You go A, B, C, D, and then it's going to repeat on the 8th note. You go back to A. Okay. Literally, the word for omega is omega, a big O. Now, it may not look like a big O, but that's what the word means, a big O, as opposed to a little o micron, which is omicron, the 15th letter, and that is also can be correlated to Hebrew ayin. These cute little double moon things there also look like parentheses. And just as another side note, Erasmus, who is considered the paragon of style in the Renaissance, calls those lanulas because they look like little crescent moons. So those are moon symbols as well. And there's 2 parentheses. I've already talked about E as 5. There are, with the lowercase epsilon over here, there are 2 forms. You're seeing the usual form there. There's another one that is called the lunate form. It looks like the symbol for a euro. Greek has some other lunate letters, because lunate just means part of the letter is looking like the crescent moon. So sigma, when it's a final, Greek, like Hebrew, has some letters that are written differently if they're the final letter in a word. So sigma lunate is a sigma at the end of the word, for example. So in 22, as we've already seen, D implies that you close that double moon and then it will go up the side of what looks like a distilling apparatus and make an alpha, unless it is the alpha dripping down and becoming an omega. But what about other O's? Because if you close that omega by this whole little play D has taken us through, you get an O. And after all, omega is a big O. Well, there are others. All right, there is omega, but here are some others. Omicron, theta, phi, sometimes said phi, like you have in a phi spiral. So that is, as they say, interesting. But if you count those in that way, you're going to count up 6. Turn the double moon into a full moon, and you're going to get 6. And then his odd math in that 3 plus 6, or 3 times 3, both are 9. And you can add your own significances to that as you would like by pondering the letters. But let's go on to this graphic in Theorem 22. Suddenly A is back. Why? If you've been in my course, you should be able to figure out why. Look, the monad is, oh, that doesn't make sense. Well, we better dig into that more. Anyway, the text is filled with A's all of a sudden. You were missing an A in 21, in 22. D kind of hits you over the head. The A is back. The text, and it's very clear in Latin. Is hard to maintain in translation, though we did the best we could. It's filled with A words. Some of them that translate in are Aries, artificial, artifice, anatomy, alpha, alphabet. So what did A in the center part of the monad workshop represent when the world was symbolically formed? Well, think about Mercury on the tree of life, and we'll get back to that in the next video. B, is B the piercing point of creation? It is if you take that center sun or gold sign as not just the head of the monad, but you make it the whole monad, which is what it is in Pythagoreanism, as we've mentioned. And then it corresponds not just to stillbone, but the pierced monad, and of course, Bereshith, the opening of the Torah or the beginning of Genesis. So that just leaves us a few more. Let's say lambda and delta, and then we're going to have alpha and omega again. Oh, down here we have a V and an X. Right away there we might suspect LVX, since that's the central symbol of the whole thing. So think of the Golem story I just told you. Amet, if you take the alpha away, Amet turns into the word for death. Well, what about if you take the L away from LVX? You don't have light. So, in effect, you're just going to have an alpha, aleph, lamed. Oh, okay. What about, you remember what aleph, lamed is, right? Sure. What about the 4 letters in the middle that are attributed to the cross of the elements? Well, you can try reading this M in Greek. I'm also going to tell you about some interesting wordplay D does with M in another work of his, GreekQabalah Aphoristica, but I'll get back to that in the next video, because we might need some stories. But what if we start correlating these things to what they are in Greek? Would that help? Mu is sometimes thought of as a double lambda. Look up a capital lambda and you'll see why it's this shape. It's also sometimes associated with the tetractys, not as much as delta is. There's a lot more association in Greek, from what I can see, than in Hebrew with geometric shapes and letters. But M is sometimes noted being in the middle. That is just a phonetic coincidence, or is it? But also sometimes you hear about, say, alpha, mu, omega, the beginning, the middle, and the end. So what do we do with D there? Well, we can read D as delta. We can also read G as a gamma, and we can remember that gamma is actually 3C. Check back to Theorem 21 if you don't remember what C is, but it's an upside down A. Or you can just cheat and flip into English and note that you're going up the middle pillar of the tree to be one with God. Oh, this even tells us the direction we're going, doesn't it? I mean, isn't writing this in English, but he speaks English. So there are all of those possibilities. In terms of Greek and Hebrew letters, it's a good thing to first meditate upon what a letter might mean without trying to get a reward for figuring it out, or as one writer says, without the lust for results. It appears that there is a greater association in Greek, like I said, with geometric shapes than there is in Hebrew. And Greek and Hebrew, as I've mentioned, largely go back to the same Phoenician root. But if you want to explore this more and explore the Greek, it's harder to find information about that. And so let me just suggest a wonderful work on this. You can easily download it. I'll put this link below, or just, you can just buy the guy's book because it's an awesome book. But let me show you some of the things that Kieran Barry does in his book on Greek Kabbalah. First, I do want to repeat again, as I've said, Kabbalah is a Hebrew word. So Barry does discuss some of the difficulties in using the term Kabbalah to talk about Greek, but essentially what is being done with letters is similar as what is done in Hebrew Kabbalah. Also, for Hermeticists who study Hermetic Kabbalah, it's quite clear to people who study both Hermetic and Rabbinic Kabbalah that Hermeticists have kind of settled upon one form and one form of the tree. That happens to be the form D uses. It's sometimes called the Kircher tree for reasons I've talked about, but there were other structures of the tree of life. And that means in those other structures, slightly different attributions. So if you go back to Greek, the Greek Kabbalah being older than Hebrew Kabbalah, even though we may think of Hebrew as an older language, you're going to see that even more so. So, for example, here is an attribution of Greek vowels to Gnostic heavens and to planets and to gods or goddesses, except sometimes these attributions will be different. And Barry discusses this. In fact, these three graphics I'm going to give you are on page 42, 43, and 49 of this wonderful book. You can break things up into hours, just like Agrippa does with magical hours, the hours of the day, and what planet they're associated with, and so on. You can do the same thing in Greek. You can even, because remember, this is coming out of the first part of the Common Era and just before, where the center of Greek language and culture is in Egypt, in Alexandria in particular, before the fall of the great library there. So in Coptic Christian papyri, you can even get associations between these vowels and Hebrew archangels and things associated with those archangels. And if you're a biblical scholar, you might notice that only Michael and Gabriel are actually in the Bible. Raphael is in biblical apocrypha, and these other archangels come from other Jewish sources. There's a lot of variations, as Barry says there, on that list. So more about this in other places and in the chart in Theorem 22. But from what I have given you, you may be able to explain that first graphic on your own. And the chart isn't that difficult. I'm mentioning all of this, though, because as I've said, D is setting out the structure in 21 and 22 for the study of the path of initiation. It's something that can take a lifetime. And one of the things, by the line of thought being developed by D here, is one of the things that you do is you study the shapes, meanings, and correspondences of letters. And if you do that, you'll also find that you run into some stories that are really kind of fun. Okay, that's all for now, folks. Have a great day. Bye-bye.